We live. All right, my friends. My name is Bishop Olsenbach, and this is my YouTube channel and my Facebook group, and I want to welcome you to the show tonight, my friends. Tonight we have Gary Wayne. He's going to be talking about end times prophecy and current affairs. Gary Wayne connects the dots into Nephilim culture. All right, my friends. If you don't have Gary Wayne's book, Genesis 6 Conspiracy, go out and get it, my friends. My friends, it connects the dots into Nephilim culture. All this Nephilim culture stuff is new for a lot of people. And what Gary Wayne book does is connect the dots. That's what it did for me. I know it's a big book and it might be able to scare you, but it's broken down into small chapters where a person can read it and digest the knowledge. All right? That's what it did for me. And I just want to hope it could do that for others. All right, we got people who are commenting. We got people who are tuned in. And we got Christine also tonight, my friends. If you're wondering who that is in the middle of the screen. That is Christine, Gary Wayne, and I. And we're going to connect the dots into Nephilim culture. All right, Gary Wayne, would you like to add anything to this?
Sure. I think, thank you for plugging my book. I have to admit, I do like a little bit of selfless, shameless promotion at times.
Well, it will change my life.
Well, and that's sort of the point. And I was listening to your comment about the size of the book, and it's a really large book. I think it would be problematic to try and talk about such a large topic and make it into such a condensed version that there's too many holes. It becomes Swiss cheese, right? It's not covered off properly, and people say, well, you can't listen to that because this and that, and didn't talk about this. And so the book that's going to be coming out is still 84 chapters. It's less than the 98 chapters in the first book, but it's specifically targeted at Christians with that same sort of in-depth information and more, so that people will have the ability to pull off the shelf and say, with so many of the controversial sort of arguments that are made, whether or not it's the sons of God, who are they, how do angels procreate, on and on and on. We all know all of that, the exaggerations, giants weren't really around at all. It's an exaggeration, things like that. And same sort of things in end time prophecy is we get a lot of different views and a lot of sort of preconceived conclusions. So it starts to give you that package that you need on some of the important issues, both in prehistory and prophecy, that you can make some bullet points and just make a case for somebody, or just hopefully copy and paste out of the Kindle version if you get the Kindle version. So it needs to be done in a way that brings credibility to the table. And so with the first book, the only thing that I really took, I think I took some hits on a couple of things on credibility is for, depending on which side of the coin you're on, but a lot of people have said, well, why is he using so many outside sources from the Bible? Because I want to let people tell their own story. We need to understand the spurious forces and how they approach things. So you let them speak for themselves, so that there's no manipulation. It's sort of, that's how they think. That's what they do with their belief system. Here's how it matches up to the Bible, and here's why we need to understand it. So, and so a lot of other people said, well, there should have been more biblical stuff. Well, that's what the second book is for. And the only reason I'm writing that is because I didn't understand the amount of angst that was out there about the unfed answers to the questions that so many people have that the churches don't teach, because they don't teach the Bible in context anymore. They used to, but not in the last 100 years or so. So they don't teach prehistory, they don't teach prophecy, and it's missing the two bookends of context for our Res Natural, why we're here, what's going to happen, why it's going to happen. And it's the most preternatural book ever written. So you ought to be expecting there are things that are saying, whoa. I mean, there's no other book on it on earth that is so supernatural. So you ought not to be surprised there would be such kinds of supernatural things that are written about in the Bible.
And Gary, and that's what you do. You stick to scripture, and that's what makes everything connect the dots. That's why you're able to connect the dots. I mean, Gary, I've heard you say this on other shows, and you said it on this show. There's a lot going on in Ukraine right now, and with
Yeah.
Russia, and Chernobyl means what in Hebrew?
Well, Chernobyl means wormwood in the Ukrainian language. So,
All
yeah.
right.
So, and I don't know whether or not that's by design, but typically, if you understand end time disasters and the sorrows, those are contrived disasters. And then you have something that's named Chernobyl for wormwood, which is basically a nuclear um, destruction of some sort, like with meltdown, things like that. But what it does is it affects the waters and affects everything around it, so it makes everything sort of bitter. And I'm not saying that that would be a direct correlation to wormwood in the book of Revelations, except that wormwood means bitter. And that it makes the water bitter. And as you take wormwood back to Hebrew, it's a poison. It's like hemlock. It's something like that as it's utilized in the Old Testament. So what wormwood is some sort of biological or nuclear type of weapon that's going to poison 25% of the waters in the end time. It's not that's this mythological 12th planet that's coming. Um, I mean, it may come down as stars, but those could be like missiles, or it could be some divine thing that is being brought down by the false prophets. I mean, we don't know exactly what's going to cause that, but it's not a planet that's getting too close. If a planet were to come too close, and it doesn't even have to get all that close, that is a complete extinction event. So
Yes.
this is only 25% destruction. Not that that's not a lot, but there's worse to come. So does a 12th planet come in place that helps deceive even the elect? Perhaps that happens, but we don't get anything of a 12th planet biblically, and typically fallen angels and all of their hierarchy don't come from other planets. That's polytheism. Where they come from is the rebellion of fallen angels and all of the creations that they would have created both before and after the flood, depending on whether or not you think they were wiped out or they survived. But there would have been a second incursion. And so there's just different types of beings that they've created within that sort of hierarchy. So they tend to come back between dimensions through portals. We get that biblically. We understand that there's Sheol, there's Hades, and the abyss pit prison is in Sheol in another dimension, and the lake of fire is somewhere else. So we can make a case for that's where they're going to come from. And it also lines up with polytheism. As you get closer to the core of their religion, it starts to become clear that that is their home of the gods in Hades or Sheol or the other world or the netherworld or An-Wen, and 1,000 different names that are throughout polytheism for it. So it's important to define everything within the Bible, I guess, is my sort of underlying point, as part of my sort of 10 major points of guideline to prophecy. And once we do that, it starts to make some more sense. And if we understand that China has said that the next world war, not necessarily Armageddon, because there'll be wars that will look like Armageddon even before we get there. People will be fooled by that. But the next world war, according to the Chinese, will be fought with biological weapons. So that becomes a little bit more sort of in the reality of what we're seeing today. That might be the cause for wormwood that would poison and make bitter, 25% of the fresh water around the world.
We're living in some strange times right now, Gary. And I just really just like to wake people to wake up and realize that this is not going to stop. And Gary, you connect the dots last time about China and the reason. What's the reason why they want for the audience who didn't get to hear you last time? Why does China want to invade Taiwan? What would be their reason to gain?
Well, it's the putting back of their empire. Taiwan traditionally is part of the Shah dynasty. And if people aren't familiar with the Shah dynasty, that's XIA as the spelling goes. And it produced two major bloodlines that are, sibling sort of bloodlines. It produced the Li bloodline. That's why you have so many Li names, and Li has several different transliterations, whether it's Li, Lee, and many other ones that all root back to the same sort of Chinese root word that run so much of China's past governments and part of the nobility, leaders of all of the secret societies, leaders of all of the mafia groups like the triads, things like that, and just part of that overwhelming bloodline of the elite. But the Western bloodline is Xi. And so Xi is part of the Western Shah dynasty bloodline, who is back in control today after taking over the monster that devoured the dynasties. The bloodlines are back in power with a very totalitarian system. It was what they would have had before. And he's now president for life, and he's going to rebuild his empire. And he sees an empire as a rival bloodline, probably with some, let's say, revenge in mind, is not going to put up with what the Western Europeans want, who are the ones who put the communist virus into China, just as they did into Russia to get rid of another rival bloodline. And just as they created National Socialism to try and get communism under control. And that's sort of eliminated the Kaiser bloodline in its collateral damage in Germany, and also sort of brought down to a less significant role by a large sort of manner and visibility, even though they're powerful in the background. But
whatever happened to the
moved down, they sort of moved down the Habsburg dynasty. Sorry, what was the question?
Whatever happened to them Kaiser? The German.
That bloodline still exists. They're just sort of in the back rooms now, right? And right. But I would expect that bloodline to come forward. Because you have a very powerful country that's identified in the Gog War, which will be the counterfeit Armageddon, which is the Revelation 9 war, which is the Joel 1 and 2 war versus the Joel 3 war, which is Armageddon. And that's a country named Gomer that's part of the Gog and Magog alliance. And that's what we would understand today as Germany from the Table of Nations.
And Og and Magog and all that's set place from Russia. Is that correct?
Yeah. So if you look at just the wording, you have Gog, chief prince of Magog of Meshech, is what Ezekiel 38 describes that. And Gog is nowhere to be found in the Bible, except there. And in Revelation 20 for another war of the descendants of these people. But Magog shows up in the Japheth line, who migrated to Asia Minor area and integrated with the giants there. And so it seems like Magog would be a name that would be been changed by later biblical writers to reflect the sins that they did for intermarrying with the giants, and or one of Japheth's sons accepted the name of a giant. And how do we know it's the name of a giant? That comes out of polytheism. Well, because a parent god before the flood named Iapetus, who Poseidon replaces after the flood as an offspring god, Iapetus creates a number of giants, and three of them include Albion, which is why it's important into some of the English history. But as it's also understood, he had two other brothers, one being Gog and one being Magog. Yes. So we have a giant name that's being used, two giant names, I would argue, with Magog as representing a people that are going to be very important in the end times. So
what about Goliath?
Let me finish. Yeah, let me finish with the question with Meshech first.
All right. Yes, sir.
So Moscow has an etymology to it, and Moscow derives from Moshkani, and then from Moshki before that, and Meshech before that. And in my new book, I'll show that etymology as it flows forward. So this is the chief prince of Meshech, the chief prince of Moscow, as we would understand it today, of that Scythian bloodline, of the Tartarian Empire, so to speak, because that whole migration of the Scythians first moves into Kiev. And that starts the original czars of the Putyanin and the Rurikid dynasty, that Vlad the Great, who is one of the sort of founders of the branch dynasty of the junior offshoot in Moscow or in Meshech, whom the Romanovs will take over for through intermarriage and another junior bloodline in about 1600, and whom Putin takes his bloodlines back to. And in the tradition of the Rurikid elite and Putyanin bloodlines, if they had a child out of wedlock, they wouldn't get the full benefits of the bloodline in terms of inheritance rights and wealth and things like that. They would be well looked after, and they wouldn't receive the full name. But they didn't want to sort of ostracize them completely, so they would give part of the name. So Putin derives from Putyanin. Now, the Putin name comes out of nowhere in about 1850 or so. No history to a Putin name in Russia or the Ukraine before that, except through the Putyanin renaming of a child out of wedlock. And that child out of wedlock was Putin's grandfather and or great-grandfather, as some would have it. And this was all put out in the Russian newspapers. And again, I have sort of documentations on that. If people want to get some information on that, I have that. So if people just get a hold of me, I'll send it to you. So, so what happens with his father is in World War I, he moves to, or shortly just after World War I, he moves to St. Petersburg, which is how he ends up in Russia. And now he's moved to the top, he's like a strong man, but he believes he has these bloodlines. And he sets up a statue to Vladimir the Great in Moscow, right? And the double eagle of the Anunnaki. And he's courted the Eastern Orthodox Church. So he's kind of like whether or not he's going to be this figure or somebody who replaces him. But this Vladimir the Great, from 988 to about 1015 was his rule. And he set up like a Slavic knight order that's equivalent to like the Golden Fleece Order or the Order of the Garter or the Order of the Seraphim, orders of the Western bloodlines of royals. And this is the Bogatyrs, as they're understood. And they were warriors and magicians and of great strength and great size. It's a giant mythology that's all sort of wrapped in there. And that's the equivalent knight order. So he's Masonic, because he would have been, even outside, he would have been introduced into the mysteries from the beginning and become an adept. So he wants to rebuild his Russian Empire. So that means Kiev is the holy city. Yes. And so he won't destroy Kiev, or destroy as little as possible, because that's holy ground for him. Wow. And so he's going to replace all of his empire. That includes many of the states straight north of there. I won't go through all the different states, but he's going to this Empire of the East is going to be one of the 5 of the Eastern empires that we're seeing forming. So you have China, which is one.
Yes, you read my mind all the time.
Yeah. You have Russia, which is forming, which is 2. And this is part of the fig tree generation of the Sorrows and the Wars and Rumors of Wars, and it'll get stronger as they jostle to put these bloodline empires back. You also have India, which are classified as Aryans or Persians, that buys all of their energy from Russia for the most part, like 99% of it. And they're likely and are making agreements as we go to align with the East with their new monetary system, their banking system, their credit card system, their cryptocurrency system, their rival system which is another beast system to the Western beast system that the European families would like to put in place. You also have Germany, who relies all of their energy on, for the most part from Russia as well. I would expect to see them move over as part of this 5. You should also look for the Persians as part of the Arians, which also includes Iran and Iraq and a few other of the oil states, and they're already moving closer to that alliance. Then you have Beth Togarmah, which is Turkey, that is moving more away from the NATO alliance and working with Putin and the Eastern Alliance more and more. I would expect to see them move away and be part of that Central European alliance of nations with Germany at the head, or Gomer. So when I'm talking about these nations, this comes right out of Ezekiel 38.
Mm.
And I think they're going to form the 5 kings on the separate foot to the 5 Western kings. And that's what we're seeing. And they are not going to accept the European view of the New World Order or the Nephilim World Order. They're not against this new order. They want a larger role, and they're going to take a larger role, and that's going to be messy.
How long are we out from China invading Taiwan, in your view?
How far from? Well, I would say sooner than later, because Xi has promised he's going to do it in his lifetime, but Xi also wants to make China the number 1 power. So he has to start to make some moves. He's been watching the Russia thing with interest because they're very, very strategic and tactical and well planning. So he's got a weak president, to say it mildly, to oppose him in the United States right now. The Europeans have no interest in protecting Taiwan, just like they don't seem to have much interest in protecting the Ukraine. That's a different sort of rabbit hole, but staying with the question, sooner than later, I think probably, if I would make an educated guess and speculate, he would be smarter to take it before there might be a change of power in the United States. Because you get somebody. Let me give you something else here before I let you back in.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
This would be an amphibious invasion.
Yeah.
So it's like a Normandy invasion. So the seas between Taiwan and China are very, very rough. There's 2 months of the year where they're not. They're the calmest, and that's April and October. I would look for, on a speculation basis, because I'm not prescient in any way, I would look for an invasion in the next couple of years, and even if it's beyond that, to happen in April or October, so that they just do it quickly and just overwhelm Taiwan in a few days.
Yeah, it's not going to take much to take over Taiwan. It's just, you know how we have the Bermuda Triangle here in the States?
Yep.
Don't they have a triangle that's similar, and it's called the Dragon?
Yep, they do.
And does that have anything to do with Nephilim culture?
Oh, probably. I mean, there's activity that goes on in those locations and other locations around the world that are unaccounted for, more shipwrecks in ancient times, places what they would say are the homes of the gods and things like that. So I think there are places around the world where there is more activity of the fallen angels and their hierarchy. So I don't think one should find it surprising that they would have a similar one. And, Antarctica is another one of those areas, right?
Right.
So how many are there? I mean, there's so many mythologies about that. You could just sort of red dot a lot of the world, but it's the larger ones that we ought to be more aware of. And of course, the Mount Hermon area is probably the largest one for that kind of activity throughout history.
Yes, they go up there and they do their little rituals, and the whole pantheon. That's what the UN is doing up there. It's protecting them, probably.
Yeah, it's
Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
I had a friend ask me a question, a really good friend, and they said they asked me what are the white hats?
So that's a polytheist term.
Oh, is
And in polytheism, you have a dual, what they call a dual religion, both on the macro and the micro. So on the macro, it's good versus evil, their God against the God of the Bible. Within the religion, they have more dualism, not only with things like a mother goddess and a male god, but also with good and evil. So you have um, white witches and black witches. You have white
mm,
magic and black magic. You have white hats and black hats. It's the same sort of allegory. You have good Nephilim, you have evil Nephilim. And so the white hats, what they will tell you is that they are not as anti-human as the black hats, and that they would not like to see all of humanity destroyed. Um, and that they see a home for humanity, but that home probably isn't a place that we would find good. So the choice on that from the white hat and black hat would be total destruction to total servitude and sacrifice. I'm not sure one is really any better, but within the craft, within that belief system, they look at themselves as poles apart in terms of what they're trying to do, but they still worship the same pantheon of gods and they still have directionally the same goal. They just have a little different outcome, not big in any significant way from our perspective, and certainly it's still going to be ruled by the pantheon of gods.
but do they
Yes,
act
sir.
like the white hats, or is this just a fictitious um kind of thing where it's controlled opposition?
Sure, it is. It's everything is done to cattle herd us into the open arms of the globalists and the bloodlines to establish their world empire. So if if we understand that we don't buy into the less evil, even though it would be marginally better, understand that it's just part of their overall game plan. So if you look at the two parties in the US, we've seen something a little bit different of late, but the traditional understanding is the establishment Republicans would be kind of like the white hats, or vice versa, depending on which political persuasion you would be, and the Democrats would be the opposite, either a black or a white, depending on your perspective. So they own both of the parties. So that's why the policies never really change. They just play to a couple of different audiences, but they're directionally going to be going the same way. So what are the commonalities? You have the neoliberals and the neocons, exact same policies: perpetual war and globalism, and the destruction of Christianity, or not to defend Christianity from being destroyed. So that's why it's so important with the political movement in the US today that you have a populist movement that is saying no to the Bushes of the world, to that establishment Republican Party that is really no different than the neoliberals. And because they're not. But the populist movement, if it survives, has the ability to push back. And that can help us a lot. But we ought not to rely on black hats or white hats of any form.
That's right, Gary.
Q is right.
Right.
White hats, Q, like this underground,
Yeah,
these
I think so.
people that are
People,
these
Oh
so-called
yeah, they
anti.
even got like
yeah,
a gray pope. The black pope and the white pope and all kinds of popes.
yeah.
There are all kinds of different societies out there that think they're going to have a chance of ruling this world, but it's not going to
Yeah.
happen. Gary, we got an awesome question from
Can I
David.
just
Yeah.
answer the question on the queue?
Yeah.
Because I think it's a really important question,
Yeah.
Yes.
and understanding for people. So do I think Q was working in support of Trump to a certain degree? Sure. But again, this is not an organization Christians should attach themselves to. This is the flip side of the globalist movement, because they're not against globalism. They're just sort of like the white hats, if you want to classify them as the white hats. So where does the name Q come from?
Really?
Yeah, it's a good question. Kabbalism. So in Hebrew, Kabbal starts with the letter Q.
Wow.
And so this is the mystical side. They show their allegories in plain sight, like all of these organizations do. Q is the first letter for Cain in Hebrew.
Mm.
So it's the same spelling for the Cadmonim or the Cadmonites as it's spelled, or the Kenim or the Kenazim. And that's like the triple K of the Old Testament. And so you have a triple K Aryan Nazi organization, left-wing politics with the Ku Klux Klan that was started by the Masons. And those three Ks all start with that letter Q in
Wow.
Hebrew. They telegraph everything if we can sort of understand their language. I mean, we'll never understand everything they're communicating, but we can identify who we ought to be associating with, who we ought not to be associating with, and be able to be pushed back and not be deceived, because they'll turn on us anyways if you partner with them. So and we have to be careful. I mean, I understand the concept that the enemy of our enemies is our friends, but if they're using us to get to the same goal, they're not really against our enemies.
Well, I always looked at it too, Gary, like Q was kind of this controlled opposition that was saying, don't worry, we have it. It's all happening underground.
Yep.
We're getting rid of the evil, and the people of the world, just rest assured this is happening, so that no one really does anything about
Yeah.
it. Right? It was
So
kind of
exactly.
was
And as it turned out, they didn't have it all under control. I mean, I was told and taken aside many times about, no, don't be suspicious of them. These are really the good guys. And I'm going, I don't think so. And I don't believe they got everything covered. And this is not all part of their grand plan that's in our good interest. They actually don't want it to succeed. But
Mhm.
anything that pushes the globalist agenda, that's what they want, as long as it favors sort of their version of what that's going to look like. So that's the same issue with the other organizations around the world, whether it's Xi or Putin or the Europeans. They all have their own vision, because at the end of the day, there can only be one bloodline Antichrist family that's going to win. It's like the Highlander movies. There can only be one. So directionally they work together, but they're also going to battle as they go.
So they're battling they're battling one another, but they're also on the same side
Yes.
in a certain way.
Yep.
Because sometimes I was kind of thinking, like, living in North America, I'm in Canada, and you hear a lot of things, with Trudeau, with different people.
Yep.
DeSantis is almost like the polar opposite of the evil. He's like this so-called savior type of guy. And I wonder, is like, from the person, okay, we know we can't really rely on mainstream media, but in the background, are they on different sides battling against each other? Or is this all stage? Or is this really, like, it's
depending
hard
on
to decipher?
depending on which theater you're looking at, if I could put it that way in a military term. So, when I look at Trump, can I say he's not a globalist? No, because he did a lot of things that were sort of moving the New World Order. He just wants a larger role for the U.S. Now, when I look at Trump, I see he did a lot of really good things, and he did good things for Christians. But that doesn't mean he's necessarily working totally in our interests. He may have his own interest in mind in that. So we want to be careful of those things. DeSantis, I haven't done any research on him. But if DeSantis wins, I hope he has the strength of Trump and the disposition of somebody that is more palatable for more people to accept as a leader. I wouldn't be upset if Trump got reelected. Certainly, we need a change from the direction that's going in Washington today in the White House. You know, you look at somebody like Trudeau, and there's very obvious red flags there with him, as opposed to DeSantis or Trump. But Trump was a Democrat before, so I mean that's another red flag. But and they all rose up against him because he knows the inside, right? And that's what they're really afraid of. With Trudeau, he's from the inside. He is the son of Pierre Trudeau, who was part of the Club of Rome, who married Margaret Sinclair of the Sinclair line of Scotland that created Freemasonry after the fall of the Knights Templar. They're best friends with the Aga Khan, and he has Christmas with the Aga Khan quite regularly. That relationship goes back that far. The Aga Khan is the leader of Sufism. Sufism is Islam's cognate organization to Kabbalism or Gnosticism for Christianity and for Judaism within Islam. So Sufism is the polytheist religion of Islam, so to speak. And so he said when he was elected that Canada is going to be the first transnational country. In other words, we're part of the global state. We don't have a country anymore. I mean, he is so obvious what he is and what he does. And that's what we really have to look at. Not only what they say, but what they do. And that tells you everything. And so if their policies are New World Order, world government, polytheism, and perpetual war, it's probably going to show up in their policies.
I always get to power, governor or anything in out part of kind of the brotherhood.
You're kind of breaking up there, but I think the question is how do they come to power without the brotherhood? Was that the question?
I thought that you can't get into politics or power without being part of the brotherhood.
Well, as it evolved, that is the case. It doesn't mean it has to be the case. So when I talk about the establishment, when they control the Republican or the Democratic Party, they are using all of their power of those organizations to only permit candidates to run and win in the primaries. So when you hear the establishment, like in the last election, saying the Republicans lost because they had bad candidates, that's the establishment. That's just saying they didn't get their candidates. So the more the populist movement takes over the party, the more they can push the establishment out and push them into the other party where they should be. And then you would have a legitimate option. So that's one of the things that I also look at Trump at very favorably and fondly on, is that he did total war against the establishment with no chance and destroyed them one by one, and the establishment, not to obliteration, but to the point where he won a race he ought not to have won. And that process to replace the establishment with a populist movement for the middle class has been stalled since his election failed. And so we need people, whether it's DeSantis or other people, to be in there that would be successors to the movement, because if they take Trump out some way, somehow, or fix the election somehow, some way, or throw him in jail, there needs to be somebody that can replace him. So I hope they sort of come together, and I hope DeSantis is what he might appear to be, at least with his most of his record, that he supports Christians and he supports free speech and free religion and all of those kinds of things.
I once read an article that Trump went bankrupt and was basically bailed out by Rothschild or Rockefeller. So that's why I've always thought that he was kind of working kind of like for them because he owed them.
Yeah,
No,
and it's his family was sponsored by the left's money too. So, but the whole country of the U.S. is sponsored by the Rothschilds. So it doesn't matter whether or not
Mm.
it, it doesn't matter whether or not it is the Carnegies or the Morgans or the Rockefellers or the DuPonts.
They run.
Endless list was sponsored and put into business by the Rothschilds to control first the banking and then the other important industry. And so they're all loyal to the Rothschilds. And so when you're going to get bailed out of bankruptcy, you're going to go to the banks or you're going to go to the wealthy families. And so there's going to be part of that. I think that's why you saw such a visceral reaction worldwide by the elite bloodline governments and bloodline parties and woke corporations and on and on and on that rose up against Trump, because when he wasn't permitted to run for the Democrats, he took offense to that and he switched his parties. And so that is something they don't forgive. And that he threatened to expose them for not letting him play a larger role within the left-wing system. So that is just that's inside politics. Now, has he converted? I don't know. I can't say. He calls himself a Christian. I hope he is. But I will not speak against Trump for his policies. I think he's been, without Trump, we would have been in worse shape now than what we are. And so we need somebody raised up, because God does raise up people at times to push back the evil, because, and he uses, like Cyrus, for example, he will use individuals that may not necessarily be Christians that will push back the beast empires and prevent the end times from coming before their time.
Or slow it down.
Slow it down, yeah.
Yeah, I heard too that he was actually distant cousins with Hillary.
Haven't heard that.
I heard that either.
I,
But we do got a good question from David Priest. And David's been hounding me in the comment box saying, man, when are you going to ask Gary Wayne my question? And his question is, if Esau cut off Nimrod's head, why are the rumors the bodies found in Iraq could be Nimrod and not Gilgamesh?
Yeah. So I believe that account that's being talked about there comes out of the book of Yasher. And in my book, I don't even quote the book of Yasher. We don't have a surviving manuscript of the book of Yasher. It is referenced in the Old Testament, so we know it was a legitimate book at one time, but the reference that it's talking about is not in the book of Yasher. So some of it's obviously missing. It has many corruptions, many errors. It's filled with mysticism. It's more Jewish legend than anything else. So I tend to just go right to the Jewish mystical polytheist legend to quote, as opposed to the book of Yasher. So I'm not saying that Esau didn't kill Nimrod, but biblically we don't get that.
Yes.
So we have to be careful with that.
And
so
he had
Nimrod,
red hair. Esau did?
Esau had probably reddish hair, yeah.
He was hairy? Wasn't he hairy?
It was very hairy, yeah, rough skin, yeah, ruddy. That's all means red hair as you take that back to Hebrew. So we don't really know when Nimrod was killed, because biblically, again, we're not told when he was killed. There's other versions that are out there that he was killed in a war, after the War of Giants sometime. Some people think he was at that time even a vassal state to the third dynasty at the time. I mean, we just don't know. We just don't have anything sort of firm to be on that. We don't have any record that Esau went into Mesopotamia, where Nimrod would have ruled. Jacob went to Mesopotamia, but we don't have any biblical record that Esau went there. We're only told that Esau went to the south and into the Seir and Edom region. So I think it's interesting. I don't rule it out, but because I don't have something biblically that even gets me into that zone to say that he killed Nimrod, It's not likely. Now, Nimrod would have been 3 generations before Gilgamesh. A lot of people
Before
confuse Gilgamesh with Nimrod as well. So if you were to look at sort of generational, I mean, Gilgamesh would be closer to Esau than Nimrod would be. And we're not given an age as to how long Nimrod reigned, just that he developed all of these empires and city states in the Mesopotamian region, and established the Mesopotamian Magi type of religion that was there. So again, that sort of leans kind of against Esau killing him as well. But again, we don't get scripture one way or the other. So any sort of version of that is speculation. We don't even get another version within the Apocrypha that Esau killed Nimrod. So hard to put a lot of weight on that. It's interesting. Maybe he did, but it's just kind of interesting. But if he did kill Nimrod, it was likely in Mesopotamia. If Gilgamesh was likely killed, it was likely in Mesopotamia because he was king of Uruk, city that he would have inherited that Nimrod founded.
Yes. Nimrod was once a mighty warrior for Yahweh, and he jumped ship, didn't he, Gary?
He did. He became a Gibberim. And so how he changes, hard to know. It's likely, if you speculate, that he received the knowledge to build Babel City and Babel Tower, as the polytheists believe, and that some of that knowledge had the ability to give him more power. Again, I think it's the book of Yashar says that he had the clothes of Adam and Eve that were given to Adam and Eve when they're ostracized from Eden, and that gave the superpower. But we have no biblical transference of that down through to Noah, and then down through Ham, and then down through Cush, and then down through Nimrod. So we have no real ability to make a conclusion there. Again, might be a possibility. We just don't really get, other than the clothes were provided by God, which by inference has some sort of supernatural sort of power that may have come with it. Who knows? But again, we're not told that biblically either, that there was supernatural nature for protection of some sort for these clothes. And if there was no other people at that time, why would you need protection with the clothes? Only if there was other people, which I think there probably was from day 6. But again, that's another rabbit hole. But again, we don't get any of that sort of biblically. So it's just sort of it's these interesting sort of rabbit holes, but they have dead ends on those rabbit holes.
Do you think Nimrod's line, his genealogical heritage, lives on today in today's time?
Yeah, I think so. He's considered a great master of Masonic history. He's up there with Enoch and Tubal-Cain.
Yes.
He intermarried with local giant dynasties there and created the hybrid giants dynasties of the East, because the post-Diluvian giants had these fertility issues. And that he founds most of the modern, as we understand them, sort of nations through his of the Mesopotamia, whether or not modern, but the ones that come down from him, whether or not it's Assyria or Babylon or the Akkadians, they're all funded by his bloodline descendants. And in polytheist understanding is in the third, I think it's the grandson of Nimrod, who actually becomes and overthrows the Hamite Pharaoh in Egypt and puts that bloodline on the Pharaoh dynasty, which is again that grafted in giant bloodline. But that Pharaoh dynasty would have had grafted in giant bloodlines as well, likely.
Well, Nimrod is from the line of, he's from Cush. That was his father, right? Cush?
Yep. Yes.
Cush was Nimrod. And then Gary just broke it for you before after. All right, Mr. Wynn, we got a really nice crowd tonight. A lot of people ain't asking. Well, I'm sorry. We got did Nimrod's? I just asked that question. I'm sorry to pop this question up on the screen. We got a question from Randall Hill, and he's asking, I think the Netherlands were the creation of day 6.
The
I don't know.
Neanderthals.
No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I was having a little
Y'all
bit
know
trouble
me
of connecting
already.
the dots there, but I managed to. Okay, well, that's we don't know who the people of day 6 were. What we do know is the creation account in day 6 in Eden, they don't match. And there's a different order, a whole bunch of different things that are going on that are different, and some incompatible details. So it seems to me that there's 2 creations. So a lot of people make the case that they would be the Neanderthals, perhaps. But I do know the word man there is the same word as man and Adam in Genesis 2. So it's the same species. So by inference, then Adamites would be Neanderthals if that was the case. So I kind of lean differently because the Bible doesn't make mistakes on those kinds of things, even though these are created a little bit differently. And again, Bible doesn't contradict itself. So it seems to me there's a special commission that's going on sometime after day 7 in the Eden account. And I also think that the day 6 people would be more
That's a whole nother
3
show.
yeah, it would be more 3 or 4 races of people. So we have to sort of look at our history biblically and say, how do 4 races show up after the flood? Because it's all from the lineage as we get through Noah. Though the lineages we don't get are the wives, but they're pure in terms of physicality and spiritually. So one presumes that they represent 3 or 4 of the races, so that all 4 show up after the flood.
Amen. All right.
And I don't, and that
Sorry.
to me makes sense on how that happens, because how does that DNA get in to create the 4
Really?
races after the flood if it's all one race, likely through the wives, because we
And
don't have a
what's
lineage on
the
that.
deal with RH negative, Gary?
Well, it's a rare blood type. It's about worldwide, it's about 15% of the population.
All right.
And it's heavily weighted to royal families and bloodlines of the families. And a lot of people say it's the bloodlines of the Nephilim and the bloodlines of the gods that was passed on. And I think that's likely the case. But the argument gets to be, and I'll answer that argument after I make the counter argument, sort of the devil's argument, so to speak, is that Rh negative is missing the D antigen. And antigens help fight off things. It's like part of the immunity system. So Rh negative is missing that D antigen. So how do you add something into the bloodlines, the blood types, if it's missing something? It's just sort of, it makes no logical sense. But that's not how it happens. That's the thing. So it's the genes that produce the blood type. So it's something in the genes that was added that produces a different kind of blood. And not all of that Rh negative blood, or most of it, except through modern technology and pharmaceuticals, mixes well with human reproductive. People, they lose their babies, or used to lose their babies because positive and negative doesn't fit well.
That's right.
Although OH negative would fit universally for almost anything, and I don't know whether that's the case with pregnancy or not. But here's the thing, though, is that in the bloodlines, they talk about the fairy gens. They talk about the Elby gens. They talk about the Julia gens. They talk about the gene of Isis. They have these different strains from these different gods and patriarchal Nephilim and Rephaim that they trace their bloodlines back to. So when you get that word genealogy, you have that word gene in there again, or the genealogical elm tree is their polytheist version of what we see as the family tree for their bloodlines that we've accepted as our own sort of imagery for our genealogies. There's something in the gene of Isis, as they like to call it, or the fairy gene, that they look for through the manifestation of the Rh negative blood. and that they are looking for people with that blood type and those genes that they want to be part of the new age going forward. And they're always on the look for it. So that's why you have all of these DNA tests and things like that. They just gain the data banks for all of this information. And Rh negative people with this gene, they have, according to research, a higher level of intelligence, usually 140 plus. They have more supernatural events that happen to them. So they're more akin to demons, aliens, portal experiences, things like that. They tend to be pale skinned. They tend to be red haired, hazel eyed, or blonde hair and blue eyed. They tend to feel that they have extra talents and things that other people don't have. And that telepathy is one of those, that they can communicate, even though it's quite diluted today, to at least in part with people of a kind, of their kind. And this comes back from that sort of bee hive mind understanding that polytheist has, and that, as the queen bee with the hive, and they can communicate through telepathy, and that they believe that this hive mind allows great numbers of people to do things working together to get things done that they wouldn't normally be able to do working sort of individually. So it's an advantage. And this is their hive mind. This is the like mind that's talked about in Revelation 17, where in like mind, they hand their power over to Antichrist. And what's interesting about that is that if you take that now back to the Old Testament, you have these giants that Israel is going up against, and hybrid giants. And they would have had this hive mind. And so what does God provide for them to deliver them up? So that they can just take their heads off by walking up to them, and that they would turn on each other. God supplies hornets. Hornets are the natural enemy of the bee. So they absolutely discombobulated the Rephaim and the giants, so that they couldn't communicate and work as one organized army, and had no ability to do war on their own. And they were in a total state of panic. I just find the coincidences it doesn't make sense that you would do hornets. You would have this hive mind polytheist doctrine, this hive mind of like mind, as it shows up for what polytheists do in the Bible in a few passages as you get into the Bible, and then God deliver up the natural enemy to the bees. And the Anjou with that fleur-de-lis, there's a lot of sort of representation in there that a lot of times they represent that fleur-de-lis differently. They represent it as the bee.
I've heard this.
Well, I heard like a symbology of Lilith, and it's known as the devil's flower, and you see it on a lot of architecture. It's embossed in a lot of things, and flags, of course. And
yeah, the flower of Lilith.
Yes, we do a whole show about Lilith. She's
it's interesting.
She's definitely a demon, that's for sure. But we do got a question from Joseph Cash. And Joseph, Mr. Cash, thank you for being patient. And here, Gary, I don't want to butcher anything, so can you see that on screen? I made it bigger.
What's his name?
Joseph Cash.
There it is. Did Nimrod's line bred into the Khan and of the Khans? That's an interesting question. So certainly one of the not primordial, but original people of the area where Nimrod was located was Elam, and the Elamites, and these would have been the Eastern giants, and that these were Aryans, Indo-Aryans, just as you had the Persian bloodlines of the Persian Empire take their genealogies back to Aryans. And the Aryans also settled in the Indus Valley. And the religion that the Indus Valley had was the same religion as Nimrod had in Persia, where he set up his empires. And that this was the religion that also migrated east. So you have the Eastern religions coming out of Nimrod, and then the Mediterranean religions on the Western side that moved over with Ham to Egypt. They've basically funded the Mediterranean polytheist religions, whether it's the Romans or it's the Greeks. And so that you have those two sort of pillars. So you have this bloodline that has a connection, not necessarily to Nimrod, but part of that structure. But what's interesting is the Khans are depicted as Scythians, so pale skinned, taller, and they took and they were expert horsemen, just as the Scythians were expert horsemen and inventors of the chariots. The Scythians were part of that Tartarian sort of empire and bloodline. So it would seem more likely that it would be a bloodline from sort of the Scythians that are connected in with the bloodlines of Putin in Kiev, and the bloodlines that went north to Germany and to Norway. But depictions of them, these are definitely Scythians as they were depicted in paintings and things like that from the eras and sculptures and things like that. There is a mythos as well, though, that the Khans also take their bloodlines back to King Og, somehow, some way. And there's also another tradition where you get like the Khan name that's used in sort of the modern Persian sort of kings. And just as you have the Aga Khan in Sufism. So you get all of these sort of interconnections. So what we do know is not Aga Khan, Kublai Khan and Genghis Khan have a declared pedigree of a royal bloodline that comes from the Scythians. I can't make a connection, though, that would go back to Nimrod. I'm not saying it's not there because of the interrelationships, but I don't have anything that's direct on that. I think it's more of a more pure bloodline that maybe Nimrod may be intermarried into.
You know, I get asked this question a lot, Gary. Why ain't there giants right today? What happened? If there's giants before, why ain't there giants now?
Well, some people think there are today. So, like with that Afghanistan account, which is pretty accurate. If it's a hoax, I mean, they've got their details down both militarily and sort of mythologically or historically from a biblical perspective very well, because those details are very important. So does that mean they survived? Were they recreated? Are they coming out of stasis if that's the case? I mean, that's the only real thing that I can sort of point to that there might be ones that survived. What we do know, though, is that Rephaim giants, post-Diluvian giants, were called the terrible ones after the flood. And terrible ones comes from the Hebrew word erit. So in the plural, it would be Eretim or Eretim. And these are the ones that are depicted like in Ezekiel 32, the terrible ones, the ones that are in the cells alongside the abyss prison, talking to Pharaoh in this dual prophecy, because they were the terrible ones that did terrible things on earth and were slain. And typically, if they lost their head and they were one of the terrible ones, you go directly to the abyss. There's no wandering the earth. There's no getting to their heaven in Hades. This is a branch of the terrible ones that are talked about in Isaiah 25, who in the end time will be slain on a mountain and totally finished at Armageddon. And so the terrible ones, as you take that back to Eretim, they were, they're described as giants. They're strong, they're powerful, but also in there it says childless and infertile. So they had a fertility issue. And so if they were going to ensure they survived, they had to intermarry amongst the humans. and mix that in somehow, some way over time. And so it was important to create the hybrids, like the 9 patriarchless Canaanite tribes who would have had Rephaim tribes, or Nimrod intermarrying, or the descendants of Japheth intermarrying to create that. But as you add in that bloodline, however they did it, it would create a dilution. So even though they try to continue to intermarry, they have to add in lower level purity of bloodlines and outside bloodlines to prevent blood diseases like Habsburg jaw or hemophiliac disease, all of those types of things that sort of affect with too much intermarriage. And so as that happens, you get a dilution of the features over a long period of time. So you become more human-like, more human in size, less of the serpentine or whatever features you inherited from your godfathers, as in the seraphim angels. And so, but if you look at, let's say, 1,000 years after the flood, and you look at a statue of Akhenaten, you see those serpentine images in his face, that long protruding chin, those high cheekbones, those large wraparound eyes that would glow, and that elongated skull that they used to put caps over top of. That's a serpent looking individual. But so you can see within that their size and everything began to slip away. And that Lugal in Sumeria meant a big man or a king, because it was the giants that were the kings. And throughout history, they wanted warrior kings, and they wanted people that were larger than the average. But unfortunately, over time, that all sort of slips away. So that's why we don't see giants running around. Now, here's another interesting connection. So the Ugaritic text talks about these Rephaim, and they're having fertility rituals to bring back Baal and Ashtaroth from the abyss to reproduce more Rephaim because they're having fertility issues. Now, King Og is part of this sort of Ugarit sort of empire that they're talking about from Ashtaroth and Edrei, as it's mentioned in the Baalim Empire that was ruling from Mount Hermon, where Edrei and Ashtaroth was located. And what's interesting about the Rephaim in this case and the city of Ugarit, that first word Ug, Og goes back to transliterated into English OWG, and rooted in another word that's spelled UWG, Ug, first syllable of Ugarit city, Kiriath, as it would be called in Hebrew for city. The second part is Arit, Ugarit. This is the city of Og the Terrible One.
Oh,
and and of course they have a fertility issue, but that's why we really don't see them. But there's so much information that's around in the language that we have of the old that tells a greater story. And in this case, it tells us why they had to intermarry with humans.
And then this is what I tell people, is that over time, when they mixed in with the blood, lines, they got shorter and shorter. They're just not tall anymore because they mixed in with different bloodline.
Yep. Out of necessity, not choice.
Yeah, right on.
Some of them have like 6 fingers and 6 toes.
Double jawed.
Yeah, there's a good case that there was, different kinds of giants, right? So, I mean, we look at the red-haired Horim as part of the Rephaim. They had pale skin and hazel eyes, just as the Tuatha De Danann of the West did. Then you have the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Tuatha De Danann that went north and east out of Scythia to the Ukraine and further east. And these are the Anakim they had, as they're depicted in history: blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale skin. The Amorites come from an Anakim patriarch because they look just like them. And so they're the hybrids and so they're like 6 to 9 feet tall versus, 10 to, let's say, 14 or 15 feet tall that Og may have been. But you also have these dark-haired giants like Gilgamesh. Yes. And he was in the Ugaritic texts and in the Sumerian texts and the Babylonian texts was cited as 11 cubits tall and 4 cubits wide, and he was the king of Uruk. So he'd be measured on a royal cubit, as Josephus taught us to measure the giants, because they were kings.
That's right.
And
also
so he would
Goliath.
have been 19 feet tall and 7 feet wide, and he had dark hair and these long curly beard. So he's like maybe the human face off a cherub. There's only why would be a little bit bigger, and a little bit different hair color. So you also have, as you mentioned, these 6 rows of the additional row of teeth in the 6 digits. And we
Yeah.
get that both in Josephus, referencing the same account as one account in the Bible, but we don't get any more than the one account. So it seems to be, again, a little bit different kind, because most of the giants aren't referenced with having that extra digit, but one was specifically referenced, meaning he was unique, maybe from a different region. We're not really told what that significance is, but that there is a difference there, suggesting a different kind of giant.
Amen.
And he wasn't quite as tall as some of the Rephaim either. So
I also heard that, I don't know if it's true, but it's something that I've heard through like a whistleblower from the Illuminati, but they said that they're holding some of them actually in underground tunnels. So that's maybe why we don't see them.
yeah, that's definitely part of that whole mythos, is that they're underground or in stasis, or a combination thereof. Yeah.
Well, I got Mama Bear in the comment box, and she's burning me up and wanting to know, when is your new book coming out, Gary? Or is it available right now?
It's in the works, Mama Bear. And Mama Bear, if it's the same one who sends me a fair number of emails, and I think I still have a few to answer for you. Yeah, I will get to those emails. But so where we are is, the contracts for the publishing is done. The schedule for the editing is in place. So the editing process will happen starting the first week of June. And they'll do each section at a time, and I have to reread every word and approve everything. So that's going to take us through all of June, probably into July. Already started working on the back cover, and we're working on cover design. And so I'm thinking, the way things are moving now, we can look a little bit sort of firmer at a timeline of maybe a September release. Can't guarantee that yet. We'll see what happens as we go. But once that editing process is done, the rest happens very, very quickly. So
awesome.
People
Mama Bear says, yes, Gary, it's me.
People can get the Genesis 6 book, and then they have time to read that. And then in September, we'll read your new book.
Yeah. And the new book, each of the books, not that the first one was done intentionally that way, but the second one was, that you could read them separately. But you'll want to, if you read one, you'll probably will want to read the other, because it's not redundant. It's new information for the most part. So, and the reason why I put my words that way is because I said I would never write a sequel to the Genesis 6 conspiracy. So I actually set another book aside to do this, because, there's, as I mentioned when the show first started, there's just such a thirst for biblical knowledge that's not taught in the churches. So this is why I wrote this book.
Well, that's right. And you know what, Gary? I came out of what I thought was Christianity. I came out of the Catholic Church just a few years ago, and only to find, when I read scripture, that it really was nothing like scripture. I mean, there was a bit of it in there, but the 10 Commandments were changed. The Catechism is what they were pushing, which was created. And, people are now really hungry for biblical truth. And we're living in these end times here, where I think that there's a lot of people that are coming to understand that they need more truth. So
that's right. That's right. We all seek the truth.
you
just got a comment from Truth Seeker, and he would like to know Gary Wayne's email address. I'm going to put it up there for you. Go ahead, Gary.
Genesis6conspiracy@gmail.com. genesis6conspiracy@gmail.com. That's the same email as when you click on contact Gary Wayne for an interview on the page, on the interview page of the website. Same email comes through to me.
Amen. Amen. Well, tonight it's been a very special night. We've had over 50 people tuned in tonight. We could be here all night long, my friends, asking Gary Wayne questions. I know I have, but we got to call it. Got to call it quits sometime.
Yeah.
And,
So
go
I
ahead.
had I was down in Orlando last weekend, and I had some people who listened to the show. Um, your monthly show with me. They were down there,
Yes,
so
sir.
I was able to meet with them, and I just thought I'd drop that. If you're in the Atlanta area on the last weekend of the month, I think it's the 27th and the 28th is the Saturday and the Sunday. I'm down there in Atlanta with the Sacred Word people, Zen Garcia's group, and we're doing a conference on Revelation mysteries. And I will be presenting on the Saturday. I'll be talking about some of the terminology of Revelation so that people understand. I'm going to cover wormwood as
Right.
one of those terminologies, and then I'm going to cover Revelation chronology on the Sunday in another presentation. And then in between those two shows, I will be around there all the time, both in the conference and around the hotel. And stop by, come see me, ask me
Yes.
questions. I'm there to be with people and hopefully
And
answer
once
some
again, Gary,
questions.
where is this at?
Atlanta at the Doubletree hotel. I don't remember which location it's at, but I think it's on Chambly. Um, and there's another word, part of the word that goes with it on the road. So I think it's on the perimeter of Atlanta. But I just got to Google Sacred Word, conference in 2023, and it'll come up and give you all the details.
Well, you got several people already stating. I don't know if you know this person. I think you do. Her name is Besley 007, and she says she can't wait to meet you, Gary, because she's going. Do you
Excellent.
know who Besley is? 007.
Yeah, I think I've gotten some emails with a 007 on there. So
Yeah, that's probably her. She says she can't wait to meet you, Gary. All right, Mama Bear
awesome.
says yes, it is me, Gary. It is me. She wants you to know it is her. All right, Mr. Wayne. I want to thank you for coming on tonight's show and connecting the dots into Nephilim culture. I want to thank Christine for coming on to the show. And, before I close the show, I'm going to pick a winner. See all this drawer that we got in front of us, right? I'm going to pick a winner. It says, get a winner. Boom. Ryan Evans. I'll be. Ryan, you're tonight's winner. All right, my brother? Get a hold of me on Facebook. I have if y'all don't know, I got a Facebook group called Seeking Yahweh's Word. Please come join us. There's like-minded people in our group. And, I think y'all really enjoy it. Brian just said, cool. Truth Seekers just said, thank you so much, Gary. What a great show, and I appreciate you.
My pleasure.
All right, my friends. Like I said, I'm sorry, everybody's, we're rocked tonight. I was a little worried at first, but y'all can see that snake that's going around. That's everybody that's commented tonight in the comment box.
The snake.
That's what they call the widget, I guess. It goes around there. But since I picked, picked a winner already, and that's Ryan Evans. Get a hold of me on Facebook. You can get me under Bishop Holzenbach or William Holzenbach. It don't matter. I'll pop up. All right, my friends. Cynthia Woods, we love you too, sister. All right. My name is Bishop Holzenbach. This is my YouTube channel and my Facebook group, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in tonight. Much love, my friends. Wow, Gary, that was a